Good morning. Can you hear me on this? Good morning? Yeah, okay. I think I'm audible on this, right? Good morning. Thank you very much for having me here. And I'm glad that I've been able to come back to South Africa, thanks to FMS, and particularly on this issue, because nowadays I'm not really engaged on the policy side of the public policy discourse. I'm more interested in the public side of the discourse. So my engagements most of the time are on the public side rather than on the policy side. But this issue, this topic, and particularly after I started reading a bit about what's being proposed in South Africa, it gave me an opportunity to look back into India and find that there's kind of a very interesting parallel between what is being proposed here and what we in India have almost gone through for the last 60, 70 years. And that's what I'm going to share with you. And it's always a challenge after Leon, because he invariably picks up what could be my key points even before I've spoken them. So while Leon was saying that the government in South Africa doesn't really know what land it has, I thought he was speaking about India. The Indian government's various departments are going about for the last 10 years trying to figure out what is it that's with them. And he expressed an apprehension that the expropriation that might be initiated may not be limited to land and get extended to various other forms of assets and property. That's exactly what happened in India. So let me tell you my story from India. Okay, I'll go through the constitution bit first and then come to the rest. And because time is short and I don't know why I'm struggling to make this work. Yeah. We actually have the longest constitution in the world, almost, perhaps 350 pages. It's pretty long, pretty difficult to read. But it has one unique point. We were one of the few constitutions written in 1950. It came into effect 26th January 1950. It took almost 3 years to write. It had a fundamental right, like the Bill of Rights in the US. It had a list of fundamental rights, 5, 6 of them. One of them was right to property. This was one of the most contentious issues in the Constituent Assembly, where they debated it threadbare. Because after all, who needed property? The property was only for the rich and the powerful. And in a democracy, they are always a tiny minority. So it was thought, why do we really need a right to property to protect the rich? But it got included because, of course, in the Constituent Assembly, as in any society at any point, not just in the Assembly, but in Parliament everywhere, the rich and powerful have significant presence in the parliaments. And therefore, it was seen as a compromise to have the rich and the powerful sign up to the Constitution, to have right to property written into it from the start. But from the very first amendment in the very next year, 1951, the dilution of right to property started. 1951, it began with 13 laws, primarily related to land. And the objective was, it's going to be the land from the large landlords, real estate owners would be expropriated with some compensation, because we had a compensation clause unlike what is being proposed here, and would be distributed to the landless or to the tiller. It has expanded land acquisition. It's gone to land ceiling, which means that you can only own so much of land. We've kind of discontinued the limit in urban ownership, but in rural ownership, in agricultural land, there is a limit that exists across India, different provinces have different extent of that limit. What's even more interesting is, I had not really used the word expropriation. We don't really use it in India. But in India, we had compensation. The courts, for 20 years almost, the higher courts, ruled in favor of compensation, and they generally tended to interpret compensation as market compensation. That is, compensation would have some relationship with the market prices. So this was a challenging issue. By the late 1960s, we got rid of compensation. We have had 7 or 8 major amendments to the Constitution diluting right to property, and compensation was one of them, where it was replaced by an amount, which basically meant that any amount that the executive decides. And because it was in that first amendment, the 9th schedule, the 9th schedule is very interesting because this is a rare, this is, I think, quite unique in most democracies or republics across the world. The 9th schedule is actually a provision which prevents judicial review from coming in over the enactment. So much of the land-related registrations began with 13 to be put in first. Now there's more than 250. And like Leon said, it is not just limited to land anymore. This legislation has included nationalization of assets, nationalization of industry, and many other aspects of that kind. Till 1978, we actually deleted right to property from the fundamental rights, which means now it's a legal right, but no longer the fundamental right that we had started off with. But the story doesn't end there. Which way should I point? Why does it? Up, it's jumping. I think somebody else has to help me. Probably there? OK, the scope, it began with landless and land distribution. It has ended up displacing 40 to 60 million people in the last 60, 70 years, most of them poor. It began by saying, who needs the rich? It's today the single biggest challenge that the poorest in India face. Because without the legal protection, the poor has no protection. The rich and the powerful can secure protection any which way. They don't really need the law. They can buy and bend the law. It's the poorest who have no options. Quite like what Maria said for Venezuela. So we have about 158 million hectares in agricultural land, because this is where it started. And we have the second largest agricultural land in the world, although we are not the largest country in terms of geographic area. So there's Brazil and Russia and China much larger than us, or United States. But in terms of agricultural land, we are second only to the United States. So it's a huge area. But per person, it's pretty small, as you can see. Much of it is very small today. In fact, the average today has come down in 2017. Here it was 1.16 hectare in 2010-11. Today it is slightly less than 1 hectare, the average holding. What's even more interesting, that today, surveys, even official government surveys, have found that 40% of Indian farmers want to quit. They can't. 70% of the farmers want their children not to take up agriculture as a profession, because agriculture has become so problematic. And we have an increasing conflict, which I'll just show next, where people who need land or who want land, either for agriculture or for non-agricultural purposes, can't really access it. Just to give you an example, I, as a citizen of India, can't buy agricultural land if I want to become a farmer, unless I can show that my family has been engaged in agriculture in some province in India. Yeah, which means that those who want to, like you have a startup. A startup is free. Anyone who has a bright idea can engage and start a company and try to make it big. it's impossible to do it in agriculture. And this has consequences, because this is just a brief, this thing of the same thing. You can see the smallest land holdings from below 1 hectare, 22%, and the largest above 10 hectare, which is not really very big, is a 10% of the holding, and just less than 1% of land is owned by people who have more than 10 hectares. So the whole thing is pretty small. This is the biggest paradox, that India today is very successful in agriculture. From being a basket case in the 1960s, with famines haunting us every couple of years, India today is a net food exporter. So it's a sea change. It's a sea change, yet we have 40% of Indian children malnourished, one of the highest in the world. Our productivity is still very low, and no wonder that people really want to figure out a way to get out of agriculture. In the last few years, this is in the last 2-3 years actually, but I could get you these kind of pictures every few years when farmers come out on the street and protest. They are protesting on a range of issues in terms from prices to trade to basically starving, because they can't. Often we have a situation where farmers simply find it more profitable or beneficial to burn their crop rather than bear the cost of harvesting it, because the prices collapse to that extent. But what's interesting is that what began basically as distribution of agricultural land to the poor and the landless went on and on and on, expanding the scope of regulations and restrictions on agriculture itself. So the focus became from distribution, was on distribution of assets rather than generation of wealth. So land ceiling, like I already mentioned, the usage restrictions, like I can't go into agriculture unless I can show that I have an agricultural family background, control on prices. The agriculture today, which we don't realize, I think that's true probably across the world, but particularly in India, since I come from there, that nowadays we hear a lot of ease of doing business and improving the economic environment and attracting investment and all the rest. Agriculture in India is the largest sector in terms of people engaged and dependent on it, 50%, half of India almost. It is the most strangulated sector. We can't go in, we can't get out, because we can't sell land. It's a tragedy of a proportion, it would have been farcical. We would have probably laughed about it if it was not a human tragedy. It's a tragedy, we can't imagine the scale and scope of it. We can't go in, we can't get out. No wonder the farmers want to get out desperately. What is more interesting, and particularly perhaps from what Leon said in the beginning, that this mindset of control didn't stay limited to agriculture. It expanded almost from the 1950s and has continued even today, when we know that India is trying to liberalize its economy for the last 30 years now. That mindset has continued even today, which means that agriculture, which is of course completely strangulated, but the other sectors didn't really enjoy that freedom that was promised. Which is not, because politically it is almost impossible to tie up the largest in order to benefit the small minority who are outside agriculture. This is the scale of the conflict. Almost a third of India is contested in terms of land acquisition. We call it acquisition, not expropriation as such. And the acquisition can be for, like I showed on the earlier slide, can be for any number of reasons: land distribution to developmental projects, road building, to hospitals and schools, to what have you, and including in the last 20 years, particularly after the economic reforms or liberalization of the last 30 years, particularly for private industry. Since they can't buy land, since we don't have a land market, a functioning land market, private industry and commercial projects invariably depend on the state giving them the land at a throwaway prices, which of course breeds crony capitalism of the worst kind. So no wonder we have this enormous problem. It virtually captures, any resource, natural resource or industry. There are flashpoints virtually everywhere now. This is significant because 66% of the court cases in lower judiciary is now related to land and property. $100 billion worth of investment is stuck, particularly in infrastructure and large projects. This has continued even today. This shows the stalled project, that is projects that are stalled, not all of them because of land, of course, but quite a lot of them because of land. It's typically had been, and it's actually climbed a bit from 9-10% to 13% today. The new projects, the public sector and private sector, the blue line is the government projects, and the red one's private. You can see that it's stuck no matter which project you look at. Again, not all of them stuck because of land, but a significant chunk of them stuck because of land. And this is the kind of backlash we are witnessing. In India, and as in many poorer countries, corruption is a big issue. And our estimate is we are generating 1 to 2% of GDP every year due to corruption stemming from land and real estate. Land and real estate are the most corrupt sources that we can think of in India today. And the other problem is extremely low capitalization, because the land records and the disputes are so large, which means the capitalization, in poorer societies, the only asset people have, or most people have, is the piece of land or property on which they are. But they can't be capitalized because the records are poor, or they don't even have a title. It can't be bought, it can't be sold. And the transaction costs are so high, which means that we are stuck with extremely low capitalization, and which is really, if you compare with how the US developed, for instance, or Europe, land was the source from which they generated the surplus for their industrial development. There was no one to foreign aid the United States or the Europe to develop. Land traditionally has been the principal source of economic asset on which the economy is developed. That's been strangulated, and you can, when I discovered it just a couple of years ago, that only 5-6% of our immovable property is actually mortgaged. And this, we are talking of property that has legal title. Yeah, because the illegal, informal ones, of course, you can't anyway. So 5-6% of properties which have formal legal title cannot be mortgaged, or has not been mortgaged, because of the insecurity involved with property. But there's a silver lining. And to me, this is why I got interested into the public side of the policy rather than the policy side, as most of you are. There's been an incredible backlash. The backlash has not come from the rich and the powerful. The backlash is today coming from the poorest end of society. The first evidence of that was in the 1980s, when we had a major dam in the western part of India. And there were hundreds of thousands, millions actually protested against it, but they were not so much protesting for protecting their rights, as in property as such, in a tangible sense. They were more concerned about their displacement and about their cultural worth of having to move from their traditional place to a new place. Today, it's very different. Like I said, 40 to 60 million people have been displaced in India in the last 60, 70 years. In 2007, the government in one province, in my province actually, from where I come from, West Bengal, Calcutta, the old British capital of India, just 40 kilometers from Calcutta, there was a small piece of land, agricultural land, which the government had acquired to give it to a private project. Many of you may have heard of it. It was to be the cheapest small car produced in India. We were to beat China in terms of producing the cheapest car possible. And the company did it. Tata produced its Nano. It's another matter, of course, that the Nano didn't really do so well in the market, But what's interesting is, to me, was not so much the success and failure of the company. Tata, as many of you may know, is one of India's largest conglomerates, and a very reputed one for that. What's interesting is that there were only 1,000 people who were affected. And that created such a furor that the project had to be abandoned, that the factory could not be built on that place, in that site. Just 1,000 people, and mind you, this is not 1,000 people. 1,000 people in a typical province in India where there's more than 100 million is nothing in terms of its votes or political influence. But this is where the public part is so critical. I don't think I'll have time to talk about it today, but we can discuss it later anytime, because that's what interests me most. Public part of it is critical because not just that the 1,000 or 400 or 500 who were losing out on that particular piece of property. I mean, considering the scale, Tata Nano wanted only 1,000 acres, which is about 300 hectares. So which is tiny compared to the millions of acres that have been acquired over the past decades. But the rest of the population in that province virtually revolted against the perceived injustice of this effort by the state and the subsequent violence for 2 years that happened in an effort to take over that land. That sense of injustice fueled a level of protest which India had not seen. And they changed a government, a provincial government, which had ruled that province for 34 years, primarily on that issue of injustice. And that injustice, not just to the 1,000 who were directly affected, but to the millions who thought it was unjust. That, to me, is power. Leon talked of the emotional bubble. This is the emotional bubble that we need to leverage. There's a huge potential, unbelievable potential allies, if only we can figure out how to reach them and how to leverage their sentiments for a just cause. I don't know, somebody should tell me about the time. There are a number of legislations which have come in, and most of you who are in the policy would acknowledge that legislations or policy instruments are never perfect. I mean, they are a result of political compromises of the time. So all the legislations that have happened are not perfect, but the reason I put them up is because they are an indication, the first indication that the political establishment is beginning to take notice. That they cannot acquire property, particularly land, and get away as easily as they had been in the previous 40 years, or the first 50 years of India's independence. And there are quite a few which are still being talked about. Okay, so I'm coming to an end, hopefully. The way I look at it is, poverty is not that we don't have cash or bank balance. Poverty is we don't have, or we can't, because of legal and institutional reasons, capitalize whatever we have. In countries like India, the poor has nothing but either the piece of land or the small asset that they use for their livelihood, because we have no state or social security to protect them. So everybody has to virtually live on their own or rely on their friends and families. They cannot capitalize. They cannot capitalize beginning with their labor, which is why just 10% of India's workforce of 450 million are actually engaged in salaried employment, either in the government, all tiers of government, national governments, provincial government, local government, and private sector. Just 10%. 90% of Indians are outside the formal sector. If we cannot leverage that, the fault lies with us, not with the politicians who are just leveraging what they think they can. Inability to capitalize is something De Soto speaks a lot about in his Mystery of Capital. The poor are handicapped not because they don't have assets, but they cannot capitalize whatever assets they have, including their own labor. Because that, of course, is their first asset, to be able to work the way they want. And historically, if you think of it, ownership of property played a huge role, an unbelievable role in democratizing societies. By democratizing society, I don't just mean having the electoral process of a democracy, but the first principle of democracy, as I see it, is the demand for political participation in decision-making. The vote is only one extreme manifestation of that process. From ancient Greece, through Magna Carta, through the US Revolution, through the suffrage revolution in UK 100 years ago. After all, even UK didn't have right to vote for women just 100 years ago. The US struggled and had a civil war trying to get a large section of their black population being considered as full citizens. All of them were defined by property. That is, the United States, at the time it was born, recognized that only those who owned property, including those who owned slaves, would be able to vote in their elections, which meant barely 10–15% of the population could actually do it. UK, in 19th century, had a law that said that only property owners whose notional rental value of property would be £10 a year. Presumably 10 pounds in 19th century would be quite a big amount. But that was the criteria, and I think this was a very relevant criteria. Because when you own property in your community, you become involved and have a stake in your community. You demand participation. In India, we had universal adult franchise in 1950. We had no criteria, neither property nor education or any other criteria. Adult franchise at 21, one could vote. It's now been lowered to 18 years. What's happening in India, and I hate to say it with Tom Palmer being here, because I hate thinking that in this idea that we are exceptional in some ways. The United States have a habit of thinking that they are exceptional in many ways. But I really think that this is an exception, at least to begin with. That we began with right to property, went on to delete it, and now a bottom-up revolution is beginning to raise its head, demanding that their properties be protected. And which means that unlike 2,000 years of history where ownership of property led to the demand for political participation, in India, it's political participation, because we are a democracy from the start, for the last 70 years. It's making people realize that they can make a difference and protect their property through the political process itself. And the few legislations that have already happened in the last 10–15 years are a tiny indication of how the popular mood is shifting. For those who are interested in numbers, I tried to compile from as many of the international indices, because all of us know, and particularly those of us from India, that we failed to live up to the potential or the promise that we held at the start. And every few years, people think, and most of us believe, that we are on the cusp of a fundamental change and reform and prosperity. But we have not really achieved it in the last 70 years. And all the indices seem to consistently reflect that. That despite the promise, we have not been able to perform. And to me, the fundamental reason is, like Maria said for the institution, that the institution of property has been so devalued and undermined that we are not being able to generate or regenerate from the assets that we already possess. The same is true for the socioeconomic indicators. No matter which one you want to pick up, we've performed pretty pathetically in most. Even in democracy index, we've kind of slipped in the last 10 years. But like I said, there is a potential seed for regeneration. And there are two elements which I'd like to leave you with. The last two. That we have a problem. And I think that's true for you in South Africa and most developing countries. Apart from the state's capacity to take over property, the state also owns a lot of property. And the taking over happens in various ways. One takeover, like you are talking of in South Africa, is expropriation of land. That's what happened in India, a land acquisition by the state for various purposes. But that's not the only form of takeover. The regulatory takings are a much larger component, which is why our performance in all those economic indicators have been so pathetic. Because the mindset of control that began with land invariably infects virtually everything else. So just because we took over land didn't mean that we had a great ease of doing business, for instance. We couldn't. Because if we have undermined the fundamental capital that's land, no business is going to enjoy the kind of freedom except the cronies who need for the investment and the growth that is possible. So what we need to do is, and particularly for the public part of the discourse, and that's where my whole interest nowadays is, that we need to be able to leverage the assets that are in people's hands but can't be capitalized, which is where the emotional bubble or emotional capital is primarily in. People are mad everywhere. They may want the government to do something for them, but they're more mad for unable to help themselves up because they know they have something, but they can't use it. So unlocking those assets, that to me and to many of my friends who are now thinking on this, that is where we could actually generate social political traction to force the hand of the political establishment. And the second one is divesting from the government whatever it already owns. And divesting, and this is where part of the tricky part is, because the divesting need not happen by capitalizing, in the sense of maximizing return for the government. If we generate, our belief is, if we generate sufficient social capital for reforms of this kind, we will be able to get the government out for much of the assets that they own outside of their core functions at literally giveaway prices. In fact, we have one proposal where we said that as is, where is, particularly for land on which people already are. And there's a law which kind of recognizes that for indigenous communities that are in forest areas. As is, where is. That is, you just divest, divest, divest. Get the state out. But to do that, we need the emotional capital that might come from helping to unlock what people already possess. Okay, so I'm through. One critical point, which is from actually not my own, but the Nobel laureate Ronald Coase. Because a lot of the emotional bubble is on the idea of some notion of justice, historical injustice, for instance. In your case, in our case, in every case. Initial conditions do not matter. Initial conditions do not matter if you have a functioning market based on property rights, because people can then trade and exchange and get to the optimum level. And which you can see virtually everywhere. You know, just think, India has, by every measure, and from my own personal experience living in India for the last 60 years, almost, I'm not yet 60, is that people, no matter how poor they are not really angry at the rich. If that was the case, India would have been ideal for a revolution, because we have a huge number of people who are really poor. And India's middle class, while it's pretty large, it's still quite poor compared to middle classes in most other richer societies. Poor never are angry so much as the rich. They are frustrated because they do not have the options to climb out, despite the hard labor that they put in day in and day out. You know, they have to work because there's no other option. Some of them may engage into criminal activities, but 99% don't engage in criminal activities or violence. That's an opportunity. That's a hope. And that's why the initial conditions won't matter. And it won't matter because if we succeed in bringing in this kind of a change, the transformation would be not a matter of decades. It probably be the change will be visible within a matter of years. So the initial conditions won't matter because it's the sense of injustice coming from the initial conditions that the political establishment is able to leverage. And let me just end since no one's actually telling me about the time. So this is India's latest achievement. A Statue of Unity, the tallest statue in the world, $500 million almost. It just got released, unveiled by the Prime Minister last month. This is India's latest achievement in whatever way you want to call it. Double the height of Statue of Liberty, Tom. So we did beat the US, at least in one respect. But to me, this unity has become a political necessity because of the next slide, if it comes along. Yeah. There are 1 million mutinies taking place over the last few years across India on a number of issues. And all of them, I could trace them if I had the time to violation of property rights. From social discrimination to corruption to farmers' unrest, virtually all of them can be traced as the consequences of acquisition, expropriation, and regulatory takings. To me, this may seem daunting, but this is also an unbelievable opportunity because there's a potential social coalition just waiting to be tapped. Thank you very much.
Thank you.